Dan, can you send Louisa the link for the meeting? She doesn't have it.
Yep.
Okay, this is Sarah Lewis, the Director of Planning and Zoning. I call this meeting of the Urban Design Commission to order. The time is now 7:03, and it is Tuesday, May 26th, 2020. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law, GLC 30A Section 18, and the Governor's March 15th, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place, as well as Mayor Cortatone's declaration of emergency dated March 15th, 2020. This meeting of the Urban Design Commission will be conducted by remote participation. We will post an audio recording, audio-video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of these proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting on the City of Somerville website. The members of the Urban Design Commission present are myself, Sarah Lewis, acting as co-chair, Luisa Oliveira, also co-chair, Frank Valdez, Deborah Fennick, and Andrew Aubar. Joining us this evening are senior planners Dan Bartman from P&Z and Courtney Kark from PISA. So the first and I believe only item on our agenda this evening is the Edge Assembly project. So Dan, do you want to have the team share their screen and start on that work?
Victor, you should be presenter now. Yep. All right. Looks good.
Can see that okay? Yep.
Yes.
Right. Yep, we're good to go.
Okay, great. Hey, everyone. This is Ryan Sullivan, Development Director at Edge. Dan, Sarah, Rebecca, thank you for hosting us tonight. We always appreciate and look forward to speaking and collaborating with your team. Frank, Andrew, Deborah, nice to meet you. Louisa, always good to see you. Nice to see you again. And Courtney, nice to have you on as well. So we're all here to talk about our project, Edge Assembly Square. It is our proposed development at 74 Middlesex Street in the Assembly area of Somerville. Victor, if you go to the next one. Just to give you a little bit about Edge, we are a Dutch-based real estate investment and development company. We are one of the largest office developers in Europe. We have about 100 people in Amsterdam, about 50 in Berlin, and we have a nice lean team here in the US where we focused on the Northeast United States. Just to give you a few of our portfolio highlights, our parent company is OVG. We rebranded our company to the Edge after we built the Edge in Amsterdam, which was the most sustainable tech-forward building ever on the planet when it was built and finished in 2014. Since then, that was such a great opportunity and great feedback from the market that we decided to instill those values into all of our buildings going forward. So here's a few of those buildings. One is Edge Olympic, which is our current headquarters in Amsterdam. Edge East Side is in East Germany, which will be housed by one of the 4 major tech firms, US tech firms. To bring it a little closer to the US continent, Unilever headquarters in New Jersey was our first project in the US marketplace. That's a LEED Platinum building, 2019 LEED Project of the Year, and also soon to be WELL Platinum building. In Boston, we have 2 active projects currently. One in the lower left corner is 401 Congress Street, which will be a very sustainable forward, wellness forward, tech forward building in the Seaport area, about 600,000 square feet. And of course, the reason we're here tonight is for Somerville. If you could go to the next one, Victor. So now coming from the Edge building and going to where we are now, we try to instill 4 of our values into each one of our buildings. And we focus on well-being, sustainability, innovative design with a tech foundation, all from day one. So these are values that we bring to the table. We communicate to our design team, and we make sure that they're considered in all the major decisions we make for the buildings. Next, please. And to give you a sense of who is on our project team at the partnership level, it is us, Edge, and our partners, Boston Global Investors, Bastion Companies, and Chems Development Corp. We like to say we have international expertise with a local experience and inclusion, and that includes our consultant team, which we think we have a great team, Sasaki as the design architect and landscape architect, which you'll be hearing from tonight, AECOM, who is our architect of record, MEP engineer, and superstructure engineer, VHB, who is our entitlement consultants, and Haley and Aldrich, who is our environmental and geotechnical engineer. Next. So, back to those 4 pillars, we've identified core values for this project, which you will see throughout the presentation tonight. To address those again, it's sustainability. We really want to push the boundaries with this project on sustainability. Wellness, we want to create a healthy building, especially considering the marketplace today. We want to create a high-performance building through technology, so essentially a computer with a roof on top. We believe we have an innovative design here that is centered around the tenant and the user. And we want to make sure we tap into diversity and inclusion. We want to create initiatives around WNBA, LB, and youth initiatives from the start of the development process all the way through to the end. So now that I've brought you through that, I'd like to introduce you to Victor from Sasaki, and he's going to bring you through more of the design.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm going to start with a little bit of overall context. I think you all know where the site is in the area quite well, but just to give you a little bit of a reference point, what we're really looking at is the black rhombus there, sort of the middle of the top of the page. This is right on the edge of the Assembly Square district, really primed for great views of the site along 93 going in both directions. But we really see this as becoming a bit of a visual gateway to the Assembly Square area as it continues with its current course of development. Now, as I said, located right along 93, but also very prominently located close to the Orange Line, close to other vehicular, pedestrian, bicycle, mass transit routes. This is kind of an amazing opportunity, we think, to launch some of the broader development in the area that hasn't started yet, but to do it in a very smart, accessible, and as Ryan said, sustainable way. We want to take advantage of all these modes of transit and let this be kind of the gateway node to the area. In addition to that, we recognize the importance that this site can play not just as a building, not just as a piece of architecture, but as a further development and enhancement of the open space network that's happening in the area. And to take advantage of, while it is actually a very tight site, which I will talk about in a minute, to help redevelop and reimagine some of the existing context that's there, to really make it all that it can be, to make sure that it feels vibrant, that makes sure that it feels public, that it is connected. Like I said, that it really becomes this gateway to the neighborhood. Part of that, of course, as I already mentioned, is playing with the existing access and connectivity to the area, whether this is the off-ramp coming off of 93, the existing bus lines, the Kensington connector coming under Route 93. We think that is going to play a critical part to the pedestrian and bicycle connectivity of the area. And as we get into describing how the building is set up, but in particular how the site is set up, we think that is going to play a major role in the reimagining of this part of the district. Zooming in a little bit closer now, you can see a couple of the aerial shots on the left of the screen here. The site today, most of it is basically an unused parking lot, kind of scrubby, fenced off. There is a Dunkin' Donuts and the Sunrise Caribbean restaurant on the site as well. The plan on the right-hand side, the main, I'm not really sure what that figure is called, the four-sided figure on the top is the prime site. And then the triangle below is the existing City of Somerville open space that we are advocating redeveloping that public space, not as part of the building, but as part of the public open space network as part of this larger project. And just a couple of more close-up street level views walking around the sites from all 4 corners. You can see the state of the site today. The majority of it is empty, not much going on there other than some weeds, and the 2 one-story buildings along Middlesex Ave. The image is there on the right. So that's the context. We zoom in a little bit and start to talk about overall design approach. Ryan already talked about what the couple of core values and the tenets of the design brief were here to really make sure that this is a building that is very sustainable, that makes sure it's very, very connected, to make sure that it is enhancing the public realm of the area that it's going into, and ultimately being a good neighbor, as well as starting to take advantage of some of the visibility of this building and from this site to make sure that it really truly feels connected and that it is here and could be in no other location. Overall, the goal is to develop a project that is approximately 525,000 square feet. We are talking 18 stories, rising about 275 feet above grade. We are very aware of the different guidelines and zoning ordinances that we are looking at here. We'll try to go through all of these this evening, but trying to make sure that we are keeping all of these in mind as we develop the broader design approach for both the building and the site. As I said, the site itself, the prime site, is quite constrained. In total, it's about 37,000 square feet of area inside the property line. Once we look at what all the setbacks are doing from the zoning requirements, we get down to a total floor area of about 32,000 square feet, particularly looking at the public right-of-way setbacks from Middlesex and in Kensington, and trying to make sure that we are maintaining as much open space for the pedestrian ways as possible. But, you know, as we dig into the different design standards, the design guidelines, trying to be mindful not only of the articulation of the building and the surface treatment, but of creating a massing here that feels like it is responding. It's not just to take the 32,000 square foot buildable area and extrude that up 18 stories and then put a facade on the mass. We've really tried to be more considerate about what that means and how we can shape this footprint to give something that is very dynamic, very approachable, and also sort of brings, we think, the relief that is needed to a building of this scale. As I said before, we think views are going to be a critical component here. You can see very primitive massings on the images on the right, just going north and south along 93. This building is going to have a presence, and it's going to continue to have a presence well into the future because of its location along the highway. It's always going to be visible. And at the same time, the images on the left, the top image there is actually a view shed analysis from, I think, the 16th floor of the building looking south towards Boston. Everything in green is what would be currently visible from the site. And so it really is visually very, very connected. And you'll see as we get into some of the massing explorations, this became a pretty important driver for us in terms of the consideration of how we start to articulate the building. So let's jump into the massing. By all means, stop me if I'm going too fast or if you need some further explanation of anything. So we did very early on explore many, many different approaches to how we could look at the site. I think there's 16 on the screen. There were probably more than this. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we did look at a lot of different approaches of how we could consider the site. I'm going to talk a little bit about our top three and what we explored in the most detail, and then narrow in on the direction that we've been moving forward a little bit with here. So the first one looked at an approach, and as Ryan said, sustainability was one of the key focal points of how this building had to resolve itself. And I think particularly with the guidelines coming out of Somerville, the push for very significant sustainability and resiliency standards, and EDGE trying to, I think, really set a new benchmark for that. One of the interesting challenges of this site is that if you consider the site to be more or less a rectangle, it is oriented in a way that is almost exactly wrong to maximize the solar orientation of the site. It's roughly 45 degrees off north-south. And so this first approach was looking at, well, is there a way that we could start to still achieve the square footages that we need to achieve, but slowly rotate the form of the building as it goes up, so that as we get higher and higher, the building orientation takes on a more and more optimized form. So it becomes essentially a series of 4 relatively simple stacked boxes that start to twist as they go up. At each one of those twisting moments, it reveals a broader roof terrace that is accessible by the tenants in the building, building off of a enhanced public open space at the ground level and allowing us to get some relief on the building as it goes up. But as I said, really to start to try to optimize the solar performance of the building. Now, these were very preliminary facades just to understand scale and how this might shape. And there were a lot of things that we really liked about this. The way that we could get some of these broader south-facing terraces, which would have great daylight, great sunlight on them, really good and powerful tenant experience. It was doing some nice things in terms of breaking up the overall massing of the building from all angles so that it didn't become a much heavier presence. And while we liked this a lot, the challenges that we were facing is that as we went up and we started to twist the building, the floor plates necessarily had to get smaller and smaller because we were still working with our same site constraints. We weren't able to project out over the road or anything like that. So we were starting to get into some fairly tight footprints as we went up, understanding that this is primarily going to be a commercial lab building, which means they've got some fairly significant mechanical infrastructure requirements, some large shafts, which gives us a fairly large core. But also to achieve the square footage targets that we were needing to get the appeal to the tenants that we were looking for, as well as just to make some of the financial metrics work out as well as we needed them to. We were also having to go taller. This building was pushing 300 feet. We had to go up a couple extra floors to make those numbers work. So that was massing option 1. Massing option 2, again, all the same approaches in mind in terms of understanding sustainability. How could we think differently about orientation on the site to really maximize our solar potential? And so this one said, all right, if we know what our ideal orientation is, can we take the facades and start to break them up into almost a series of books on a shelf stacked next to each other, where east and west are facing a little bit more true east and west, and north and south are facing a little bit more true north and south, as well as starting to recognize that maybe we have the opportunity for some larger openings in the facade to recognize some of those more distant views and how you're going to look out to the building surroundings, and actually how you're going to perceive the building from the distance. So I think also quite interesting, and we were beginning to explore how the north and south facades would be different from the east and west facades, all in terms of how we were going to control a daylight and maximize any potential for solar energy gain. This one worked actually reasonably well in terms of the square footage that we were trying to target and the heights that we were trying to target. I think ultimately we moved away from this scheme because it didn't feel like it was quite fitting on the site in the right way. The geometry moves that we were going through, in addition to creating a lot of corners and potentially a lot of construction complication, as well as some maybe challenges in the efficiency of the floor plate for a tenant, also started to feel a little bit like it was forced onto this otherwise diamond-shaped site. So we moved on to a third approach here, which is ultimately similar to the direction that we wound up going. This one said, okay, instead of starting to try to take a series of pieces and either stack them, rotate them, shift them, could we imagine that we took the larger footprint of the site and started to fold in pieces of the facade geometry to allow us to get large portions of the facade to be at a better solar exposure, either closer to east-west or closer to north-south, as well as then allowing for that to create these fissures in the facade that started to reference different critical points to distant views or how a passerby was going to see the site, as well as to start to create opportunities to create green spaces, accessible balconies, other winter gardens and atrium spaces as you moved up the building, not just confined to the ground plane, not just a terrace here and there, but larger, really cracks into the building that would allow anybody going by to almost get a glimpse into the life of what was happening inside. And so that ultimately these larger fissures became these great doorways, these great windows into the life of the building, as well as starting to create a fairly rationalized floor plan from a tenant point of view, with moments of opportunity to create special interior moments, but overall a very functional, very flexible way of using the building, and still giving a great dynamic on the exterior of the building that was responding to its context. And it's different no matter how you look at the building. You're always going to see a different thing depending on how and where you were standing on site. And so just to dive into in more detail, these moments, these fissures are driven by very specific connections, right? Whether it is the view to the south to Boston, to Foss Park to the west, back to the Mystic River to the north, to the Assembly Square T-stop to the east, that these become these kind of, like I said, iconic doorways into the building, and a way for people to perceive the building, to look at the building, to recognize the iconic nature of the building, and for those inside to be looking back out, as well as a way to break up the overall mass and form of the building. The other thing that we think is really, really critical about this site is that there is no back to it. There is no side to it. Because of where it is sited, it is essentially all fence. And so, you know, looking at the design guidelines, the zoning ordinances, and talking about primary, secondary, tertiary facades, what we really see this as we have primary moments, we have secondary moments, but we don't have, like I said, there is no tertiary facade, there is no back to the building. It is about recognizing a hierarchy in the facades itself and creating these moments of visual attraction for the eye to go to that either signify entry, that signify retail, that signify other public space, or signify these larger, more distant connections to the building from its surrounding context, all while trying to, you know, accommodate the understanding how the facade is going to be very, very public along the main thoroughfares, along Middlesex, along Kensington. And so that's what you see in the two diagrams at the bottom. Along those bases, and I'll show you a more detailed plan, recognizing that we really want these fronts to be very, very active. And it's only along secondary connectors where we have back of house space, access to loading docks, things like that. Also understanding that we want some variation as we go up the building, that this is not just a singular extruded box, but of particular importance, understanding how this building needs to meet the ground, how it needs to interact with public perception. Anybody who might be using the open space to the south of the building, who might be walking or biking along Middlesex Ave, that we want this to feel like there's a more human scale at those bases, that we want to be very, very transparent, very welcoming, very attractive, both from the retail side, but as well from the building entry and building lobby side. We don't want there to be a barrier so much between the street and the interior. We want it to be a continuous flow. And then as we go up the building, sort of looking at the broader field of the facade, which we'll talk about in a little while, and understanding how that starts to transform subtly at the top of the building. So it's part of the same fabric. It's not about putting a hat or a top on the building as much as it is allowing that to evolve a little bit. Like I said, and I think I've touched on this already, you can see a little bit of the plan, the diagrammatic plan at the top. Everything in the teal color and the light blue color are really meant to be publicly visible and publicly accessible along Middlesex Ave, along the Kensington open space, even along part of the McGrath Highway sort of extension there, to make sure that anything where a pedestrian or a bicycle or really even a vehicle is primarily moving is visually very open, visually very connected, and feeling very public. And that as we then go vertically up the building, I mentioned the idea of these fissures in the facade really opening up to be balconies, to be winter gardens, to be terraces, to being green space that start to get activated by the tenants on the inside. And that green space becomes really, really important. I think it's very critical in terms of the messaging of the building, the sustainability approach here. We don't want this to be something that is purely behind the scenes. You only know it if you know it. We want the life of the building, the idea that this building is trying to foster a healthy environment and therefore healthy occupants to come out in terms of how we redevelop the landscape, how we start to create these green terraces, how we start to create green roof spaces, how we start to create green balconies, and then winter gardens and potentially even atrium spaces inside that really get revealed as the building starts to crack open. And so you see here in this diagram the idea that as we stack up, every floor, every other floor gets a balcony space that sits in within these fissures. So there's always outdoor space that is accessible by tenants inside, but there's areas for planting, there's areas to literally bring the visibility of life inside this building to the outside, to make sure it always feels very, very active. And then the building does evolve as it starts to go up the stack of the building. So it's not always the same extrusion going all the way up. Now we're going to switch topics here just for a second before we get into talking a little bit more about facade articulation. Jason's going to talk a little bit more detail about some of our approaches to making sure that this building performs, because that is in large part what is driving our approach to the facade articulation.
Thanks, Victor. So the transition here is that Victor's told us this great story about how we get to a very articulate massing that really is the best way to drive towards performance metrics, is get that massing correct. And that makes the next step of looking at the performance metrics of all the building systems and how they begin working between the facade and the massing to get us the goals of sustainable Somerville sustainability goals. So if you look at this slide all the way on the right, you see the goals being net zero energy capable, LEED, platinum, certifiable, and carbon neutral capable. Those are key drivers for us. And what's great is they really align with Edge's approach from their business model. So they came to this project knowing that those were also their goals. And so that provides us a range of solutions. Victor already talked through all the critical ones on the massing, this key massing moves. Then there's a series of ones about balancing the daylight and balancing the indoor air quality and working that through the view shed of how that works between the mechanical systems and the facade to focus on the kind of vision, which is focusing on energy reduction, indoor air quality, greenhouse gas emissions at the same time, and occupant well-being. And all of the pieces really focus around that set of that vision piece. And so I'm going to talk through some of the way we got through some of those solutions. Next slide, please. So when we think about getting those capabilities, those ambitions for both Somerville and this project, we tend to start with an analysis of what EUI is. So that's energy use intensity. And so an average baseline that we can look at for energy use intensity is about 79. That's K BTUs per square foot. And that's the metric by which we can look at how the building performs. And it takes into account the massing and the systems and the facade and all those things together. To be in that capable zone, we want to have an EUI of somewhere between 32 and 58. And there's a range of things that we look at in steps. And you can see we already did optimized massing and orientation. We are going to talk about envelope materials and the part that plays, and also renewable energy. So bracketing that 32, that green section you see. And then advanced MEP systems are where we're really driving to make sure that the parts that you don't see of the building are supporting the parts that you do see on the building. Next slide, please. So that is also confirmed with where we're headed in our snapshot of the LEED scorecard of the current iteration. So we are very comfortably sitting at 80 points with the design as is. And while I shouldn't have to explain this, I think it probably does need some explanation, because I finally looked at this the columns of green, orange, and red, and it's not a stoplight. That's really critical to understand. Green is what we have in the bank. 25, the yellow is what we think that we have, which I think is running at 25 or 6 points. And then the red points are ones we think we're not going to achieve. So we feel that we're going to get a large sizable point, a large sizable growth in points from the yellow moving into the green column as we progress. But today, comfortably in the place we're sitting with 80 points in the bank, and we'll probably end up with 10 or 15 more from that a list on the yellow, which will move to the green side as we go forth. And they're focused around things like those green spaces that Victor talked about, that they're both doing something for the scorecard, but they're also doing something for the community and for the city because we're able to see those points in action. Next slide, please. So to start that discussion about how those systems can support the massing and the facade, we took a look at what a Boston baseline would be from ASHRAE, Boston area baseline, and what the Somerville ambition is, and all of the things that we can focus on to help drive the performance of the building forward, taking as much of that performance into the systems as possible so that the facade and the massing can do the rest. And what we really started looking at is, of course, the mechanical systems, and then ultimately that drives us into what we can do with renewables. So if you go to the next slide. So when we had a integrated workshop where we worked together to develop 3 options to try to get us into that zone between 32 and 58. And you'll see numbers kind of the third up from the bottom of 59 on the left for option 1, option 2 at 48, and option 3 at 45. And these are combinations of different heating, cooling, air conditioning, ventilation systems that we think we could use in this process to help us move forward. Obviously, we favor option 3 at the moment, but option 2 has also a lot of support for it. Option 3 gives us the most lead points at 13. It gives us the lowest energy use intensity squarely in that zone that we want to be in the capable and certifiable categories. And it's also modular and expandable, meaning it allows the building to have flexibility over time and move us towards electrification in the future. All key things to help the building live on as a kind of beacon for performance and sustainability well into the future. It's really, in this case, about future proofing. They all work. But they're ranked really, option 3 is the one we like most, and it's where we're headed today. Next slide, please. Okay, so where does that leave us going back to the comparison? So if we compare the 45, we ran instead of what you see from what was originally 79 from the baseline, which is a listed standard, to a modeled standard of what the building would be for Boston. That's 96 kBUs per square foot. We are half of that. Less than half of that with the current energy modeling, and it's a full energy model that gives us 45 kBTUs per square foot per year. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that cuts that down to less than half as well. And that's the area that we want to be in to allow the skin to begin doing the rest of the work in terms of including renewable energy systems and how the modeling of the daylighting that Victor's going to talk about and those things work together to help get us to the next chunk towards the zero capability.
Right. So what does that mean in terms of facade then and trying to take that to the next level? Our goal here was to look at several different factors and figure out how they might combine into developing an intelligent and sensible skin. Right, one of those, as Jason just said, daylighting. How are we going to make sure that we're going to maximize daylight potential while minimizing glare? How are we going to allow the facade to start to help self-shade some of the facade? How are we going to be smart about window-wall ratio, trying to let as much light in as we can while trying to insulate the building as much as possible? And how are we going to plan for the potential for photovoltaic electric generation on the facade, in addition to what we might typically find on the roof? Can we actually make this facade work for us, both actively as well as passively? And doing all of this in a way that is implementable, that doesn't feel like any component is an add-on, and that we can do it with a smart kit of parts, that everything is not custom on every single facade, on every single panel, but it's done really, really intelligently and in terms of how it's oriented, how it's dealing with particular sun exposures, how it's dealing with views. And so that we start to look, as I said, at this kit of parts, varying the sizes of apertures, varying the size of solid panels, varying the amounts of PV on a facade as we go around and as we go up the building. Now, what we're showing here is a solar radiation mapping on all 4 facades of the building. The top 4 drawings are an absolute scale. So it's taking each facade relative to the other one. So obviously the south facades are getting a lot of sun, the north facades are getting much less. The darker the red, the more solar intensity. And this is mapped over the course of the year. The bottom 4 drawings are exactly the same as the top ones. It's just we are looking at each facade individually so that we can better understand the gradient that is happening along those facades. So the 2 drawings on the left, for example, you can see if you look closely, they are a different version of the same drawing. You can just see the gradients a little bit better. I'll explain why this becomes important in a minute. We also wanted to look at a lot of the stuff that Jason's team was leading is if we are going to put PV panels on the facades, what is the most optimal orientation? Is it integrating it flat into the facade? Is it doing it as a horizontal at the right solar angle? Is it doing it on the verticals in the right orientation? And this is a lot of modeling, but you can see ultimately where we get to is the image all the way on the right that seem to have the highest level of optimization for efficient and smart power generation. Just looking at how these are going to be stacked vertically on the facade. Again, you'll see where this goes. And then Jason also mentioned understanding window wall ratio and daylighting and the impact that might have on the interior. So again, a lot of detailed investigation, detailed modeling, iterative modeling around looking at optimization of the window wall ratios to maximize daylight on the inside. And all of these have started to play into looking at creating a kit of parts that starts to work with the power generation, with the window wall ratio, with doing a smart kit of parts that fits modularly with our structural bay. So in this case, we've got a 24-foot structural bay. Each one of these is a 12-foot wide module that spans floor to floor. And looking at how we can start to create a kit of parts that is going to allow us to develop smart variation across the facades based on the potential for power generation and solar shading of what's happening on the inside. And so whether this means we've got 1 unit of PV, 2 units of PV, 1.5 units of PV, all start to give us different approaches to how we can mix and match them across the facade. And these are just examples, right? We've gone through and looked at what it means for the square footage of PV versus the square footage of glazing and how that starts to tie into the different requirements for performance across all 4 facades of the building, all while working with the structural module of the entire system and allowing that to start to be expressed across the facade. So we have 3 facade options, and there are actually more that we explored, but these were sort of the 3 strongest contenders. Again, all based on the same final massing that we came up with and all based on the same essential requirements. So in some ways, these are variations on a theme, right? We're trying to deal with solar panels in a vertical orientation. We are trying to track the solar radiation that's falling on the facade. We are trying to deal with the appropriate window wall ratio. All of these components start to give us these variations across the facades. So I'm going to march through these quickly before we get to sort of the direction that we've been heading most recently. Option A was trying to say, okay, can we do this basically in 2 panel types? One with a singular module wide PV panel and one with a double module wide PV panel. And the other aspect of this that I'm not going to get into excruciating detail on is looking at the different photovoltaic system types as well, whether it's a monocrystalline, polycrystalline, thin film PV. They all come with different efficiencies, different requirements, and different opportunities. But this particular approach, option A, was really looking at, can we do this in 2 panel sizes going around the entire building. Again, mapping where that solar radiation is falling. And so you can see the 4 facades in a diagrammatic fashion at the top of the building. You start to get this almost skyline effect. And we've got more PV where we're getting more sunlight essentially. On the north facades, these would largely be dummy panels because we didn't want just a single blank facade, which is what we probably could have done. But like I said, mapping the facades relative to only themselves does give us variation. So it's still a consistent story, a consistent intent, but we wanted to bring a little bit more variation there, as well as looking at how this impacts the interior, which are those small renderings down on the left, what it does to daylight as well as glare and views across multiple floors. And so as we walk around the building, you can start to see how the system maps across the facades. And you really do wind up getting a clear delineation between the 2 panel types.
Victor,
Option
I'm gonna interrupt for for a moment because so far this presentation has gone on, sort of about just over 30 minutes, and I want to make sure we're close to wrapping up so that we have ample time to discuss the issues that the commission has to actually address.
Okay, I will fly through the facades. We're almost done. Because you're gonna see the theme here. Option B is really looking at, okay, let's introduce a 3rd module because I think we were feeling in the first option A, it was a little too stark contrast between the 2 panel types. This gave us a little bit more subtlety, a little bit more flow between the panels, and a little bit more of a graduated appearance across the facades. Still sort of hitting all of our targets, but we thought maybe doing it in a little bit more of an elegant way as we walk around the building. And then the 3rd approach is sort of something dramatically different, like going back to the 3 panel types, but saying, oh, maybe we can do this with a little bit more of a almost dot matrix approach. Still trying to work within the same parameters, but you can see as we walk around. And ultimately, the direction we wound up going was the middle one, the option B. We liked the idea of the gradient across the facade, that it gave a nice variation, that we were really able to tell a strong story between the south and north facing facades and get that variation, not just in the massing, but in the facades themselves. And so you can see as we walk around. The other thing that was really important to us here is that at those fissures in the facade, we started to inject another material, something warm, something wood-like. We're still playing exactly what that is. But that we really start to call attention to those moments as hierarchical points on the building. And as we look at the base, we recognize trying to call attention to the scale of the retail storefronts, the lobby storefronts, bringing a different scale and a slightly different texture that is still related to the structural module and what's happening up above, but trying to be mindful and cognizant of the design guidelines. So I won't get into all the details here, but we can come back to it. Same thing. And then, like I said, just looking at different components, right? The images on the right, trying to make sure that we've got a lot of depth, a lot of texture, a lot of variation on the bulk facades, that we have these very hierarchical moments that we are calling attention to in the middle images, and that the lobby and accessible entrance to the building becomes very, very transparent and connected to the public open space that is directly across from Kensington that we are looking to redevelop. Let me pause there then, Sarah, because there's a whole site piece here. I don't know if you want us to try to run through that quickly or if you want to talk about what we just went through first.
I am going to, at this point, because the public realm is actually going to be treated as a separate application later, I want to take a moment and go through with the commission and let them make the decision. So the design guidelines for Assembly Square, let me turn my webcam on. So at least I'm not then a floating voice. The things
Sarah,
that we, yes.
I'm going to steal the presenter for a minute from Victor and then give it back. so that you can use this presentation as a prop, but I'm going to show the design guidelines in the meantime.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sure you all agree that this is an amazing story, but there are a lot of things that have been presented that give you the background to, sort of obviously as designers to help understand how things have been progressing. But there are certain things that we are obligated by the zoning that we must review. And those, as you know, sort of they were Dan sent an email this afternoon, so hopefully you had time to review some of those, but we can choose how we want to go through those and whether we go through those now or whether you want to hear about the public realm portion, as I said, which will have to be a separate application later. I think we can decide how we want to pursue that. So what Dan, yeah, go ahead, Dan.
These are just really on the screen for the sake of the video. Afterwards, we reminded the commission of these earlier today, and these were also covered in your presentation. But this is quickly, I also broke these down kind of by topic. So there are, for the sake of the commission, there are certain design guidelines related to architectural bays, the location, alignment, and massing of towers. That's really only applicable to residential buildings. Some ground story guidelines, connection to abutting open spaces, and then materials. So I do think it'd be valuable to look at how the building interfaces with the sidewalk and any landscaping proposed on site when we're through with the building related items.
Thanks, Dan. I suppose my question is to the commission. How would you like to talk about the building issues right now, or continue with the presentation to talk about the ground story and the interface with the landscape?
I mean, if the landscape and all of that is going to be brought as a separate permit, I think that I would rather review that separately. We've gone actually 50 minutes already in the presentation. So, trying to be efficient with time, maybe we stick with what we've seen and then review the next one when it's brought forth as an application.
But Ryan, if I am correct, most of your landscaping is actually in the public realm of the sidewalks. Is that true? Outside of the new public space adjacent to the building?
Well, Victor, you may be best to speak about this. So, Victor, can you just describe a little bit of what's on site and what is on Kensington Avenue and South?
Yeah, I mean, on site, part of it is sidewalk, but part of it is expanded sidewalk, because we actually made a fairly significant effort to set back large parts of the ground floor along Kensington and along Middlesex from the required setback to develop additional open space at those levels to make sure that it feels the areas along the lobby, the areas along the retail feel as public and connected as possible. So, I mean, there's a decent amount of open space there in addition to what is happening to the south of Kensington. It's not a giant piazza, but there is some there. We're happy to go through it however you guys want.
I'm going to make a recommendation, if it's all right with the board, that we go through the architectural now, and then if we have questions as we get to sort of the ground story, and any more of the sort of the entrances and the site requirements, and sort of the later ones are the connections to abutting open spaces. So, I mean, those are things that we have to review as part of.
I think I was going to say I've had a chance to go through the whole presentation. So if I have questions on the public realm or suggestions, I can actually make them as well, and the team can address them next time or today. whichever way it is.
Okay, I'm going to give Victor back the presenter, and he can use it as a prop for any of the question and answer session.
Okay, so I think the official way to go through this is to go through the guidelines as they are outlined and sort of discuss each one. We, the staff, will be taking notes as we go along. So as you recall, the goal is that we need to be able to submit a report with, sort of the coming out of this meeting that identifies a preferred schematic design concept, identify if there are priorities to the design guidelines, which ones those are, to make sure that the design guidelines are achieved to your satisfaction, and then any modifications that might be necessary to the proposed schematic that get to the outstanding issues that might not be met by said guidelines. So if
Aaron, that's
yes.
also a floor of the UDC's purview. If they would like to add any commentary outside of those four things, they're certainly entitled to do so. The zoning ordinance is just a floor.
Okay, so how do you want to do this? You want to talk about the architectural base? I mean, sort of, right? I think sort of grouping these, thank you, Dan, is a whole lot easier to go through them. So who would like to start? Oh, don't make me pick on you people. Come on.
All right.
I'm wondering if this is a tough way to talk about the project by, I think maybe some exploratory questions, that are more general, would help us get into the topic of architectural bays, and towers is not relevant. If my understanding, I'm looking at the notes that I printed
Correct.
out. So what are the four categories? So the architectural bays, towers, ground story,
Yes.
connection to buddy,
And materials.
and materials. Okay. The towers is not relevant. But we're not going to have a discussion today about the ground story and the abutting open space? Is that?
You're certainly entitled to a discussion about the ground story, but the actual park or plaza that is proposed for the lot beside the building, that is a separate, that will appear before you later on.
Okay. Very, very strange. It might be, can we give the design team a chance to just talk, spend 3 minutes talking about intent for the ground story, just so we have sort of everything that we're going to have presented to us, presented.
Most definitely. Victor, do you want to keep moving forward and talk about the ground story and the interaction of open inside and outside?
Brief, yeah.
You want to, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure you want to talk about the ground plane in terms of the landscape, or you want to talk about the articulation of the base of the building?
The articulation of the base of the building and the relationship of indoor and outdoor.
Sure. Okay. Yes, I can do that very quickly. So I'll just start where I am right here. I'm going to say there's 3 components to this, right? One is the side that's facing the highway, which is a more opaque facade. There's not a lot of people back there. There's an access drive to get to the public storage building parking lot. It's pretty secondary in that situation. The 2 key components, though, we really think are the image that you see in the top left here, which is really the south-facing facade facing the Kensington public open space, right? This is really the lobby of the building, which we see as having still to be determined exactly how it works. There's some sort of active retail or food service of a small scale that it feels very open, that it feels very public. The goal here was to literally make this as transparent as we possibly can, because we want it to feel like a seamless flow between that great new public open space and this lobby space. There is not meant to be a visual barrier here. This is a 35-foot tall space. That canopy is meant to be fairly extensive and help shade this area and shade that space, but it is really about connecting the exterior space with the interior space. And so we actually just want it to be almost visually not there at all in terms of facade. As we come around east along Middlesex, you know, this is really retail space along the facade. So it is very public from that respect. We understand the need to start to break down the rhythm of this facade. We still don't want it to be opaque. I think that makes a lot of sense. The goal is to have it still be very, very open. There is this cantilever that still sits up at that entry canopy level, so bringing the height of that lobby across the building. This is allowing us to get a deeper setback along the street front and get some more public space on the exterior of the building. But to start to bring in the structural bay with that rhythm, to start to bring in a more expressed mullion system, as well as really recognizing the necessary portal nature into these retail storefronts. So it's meant to be one continuous but evolving facade type around the base of the building on these public facades. So maybe that's enough of the 3-minute version, but happy to answer questions.
And then can I ask one more question about materiality? The slide before, there's a warm, you know, it seems to have the backdrop to that open space. It was from the rendering, yeah. Is that warm color, is the intent that materially that relates to some of these vertical folds with gaps?
Yes.
And also the ceilings. It looks like maybe some of the ceilings are also in that idea.
Yep. I think we're still working through the details of that, but yes, absolutely. The goal is to, you know, I talked about sort of seeing the life inside the building. It's also about seeing the warmth, right? We want this to be really, really inviting and comfortable and almost have more of a hospitality nature. This is not about being a cold, stark, sterile, security-heavy front door. This is about, this thing should be glowing. I think this rendering is fairly evocative of what the goal is here, though probably we actually want more greenery in that space. But that there should be texture, there should be warmth of material, there should be wood, there should be life to it. I think if you actually look at Edge's whole portfolio of projects, there's always tremendous amount of wood and vegetation. Probably more side, just because of it's all about how people inhabit it and occupy it. So yes, that is absolutely the intent.
Sorry about that. One more question about materiality. So that's juxtaposed. Can you describe the materials of the facade? Again, I'm sure you did, but there's a lot to catch in your presentation.
Yep, no, that's fair. And I will say, to be fair, it's still being slightly developed because most of what we see on the facade, like the image on the right, top right there, most of the surface that we see right now is planned to be photovoltaic panel. And so what we don't have yet, because we're still working through the details of all the systems, is exactly which technology we're using, which then points to what our color options are and how it all gets articulated. So I actually don't have all the details. Yep.
So I was going to say, in the case then, Deborah and Victor, and since we are one of the components of what we're reviewing is materiality, and there seems to be actually very little component of materiality presented, that we can't make really a call on it, aside from the fact that we know that there's a lot of photovoltaic cells on the facade. I think that I would love to have the opportunity for the team to continue exploring that at a certain point and really present to us a more developed palette of the materiality once they have an understanding of what the technology is, once they know what the photovoltaic cells are going to be with the materials that are going to be adjacent to it. And that, I think that we'll be able to then talk a little bit more elegantly about the materials, which is one of the components of the guidelines that we need to talk to. So I would say that right now we have an idea of some things, but there's not a lot of things to look at
Sure.
from a material perspective. And if I were to just go through, I would like to say, Victor, by the way, it's a great presentation, a beautiful, beautiful presentation, a great building, and very ambitious. And your clients and your guys' capability of bringing forth such a vision to the city of Somerville, I applaud you on that.
Thanks.
On some of the components, I think that when you look at the ideas, at least from my perspective, that the facade should, be vertically articulated in a series of architectural bays. I think that, looking at the facade, I can begin to see that really you've expressed some of those components in the bays, and that they're beginning to show themselves in a way that are reflective as to some of the guidelines. In a way, you've also tried to explain that you've done part of that as well with the structural base spacing, which in some of your presentation, you said that your windows are 12 feet and your bays are 24. So you begin to also address some of those components well on that. The one thing that I was going to address to you on that was you, on the diagram that somebody has some like background noise and I don't know who it is. So it keeps...
I was about to interrupt. If you're not speaking, could you please mute your own microphone? Thank you.
The other thing that I was going to say is like, it's hard to deal with the idea of like the bottom, middle, top in a lot of these buildings when they get to a certain scale, and how do you really express it? But there are innovative ways of expressing the idea of really how your bottom and your middle and your top really begin to be articulated on the facade. And I think that I can begin to see some of that very well defined in the base. I can see definitely the middle well defined, but I think that your top and the majority of your renderings, excluding this one, which is now fully really also showing that, it really just shows the building going all the way, to the top. It really doesn't show a slight break in the idea that what we have at the top is really the penthouse, and it's a really mechanical space, and there's a change in materiality. So I would say that a slight more dedication of really the articulation of the crown. I know that you said that you don't want it to be a hat or anything, and I would agree with that, but finding a way that there is a top to the building and how that is articulated, I think it would be interesting to see develop in the same way that you've developed the base of the building on that.
Yep.
I think it would be just interesting to see. The one thing that I did want to talk about is, and you spoke about it at the beginning, and I know that it's going to be a continuation to the submission, but the idea of connecting to abutting open spaces, and this is actually something that we've been talking about for a while, and it really hasn't come to any fruition in any way, form, or fashion. But now you find yourself that your building and your development is in proximity to that pedestrian connector that goes underneath the 93 pathway. And you talk about it, it's mentioned in your diagrams, but there's really no design intent to it. And I would hate to think of the fact that it's going to be a lost opportunity here, in which we have this connector that really passes through your site, and people do use it. I see it all the time. And we've been talking about how to really create a safer way for people to cross, a more designer-friendly, sustainable, well-lit connector that really brings people from that side underneath the highway into the Assembly Square area. There's a lot of people who that either bike through there or that walk through there because they don't have cars. And I think that it's something that I really, really would love to see your project detail and address in some form. I know that you're doing
Frank,
yeah?
Can I interrupt for just a second? So this
Sure,
is something
sure.
they have been addressing, but keep in mind the Kensington connector actually connects to the open space of the park. So I mean, it might be one of those things that Victor, if you have a site plan and you want to talk about some of those connections, I think it's, without getting into landscape design per se, I think it's probably worthwhile to let the commission see that.
Yeah,
Sarah,
I mean, I'll
if I may, real quick,
go ahead.
just as a point of reference, Deborah, you were asking this question earlier too. The building requires site plan approval, and the civic space requires site plan approval by the zoning ordinance. That's why there'll be two separate applications.
Yeah, I will just say, Frank, to your point, we totally agree in terms of the connector. I think that the connector itself under the overpass is being handled by somebody else. But we truly believe in the importance of this and seeing that this open space out front really becomes, like I was saying, this is kind of a gateway to the area, right? It's not about this building, it's about the broader district, and making sure that anything that we do is enhancing the safety of that, is enhancing the quality of that, you know, and is really about a strong connection through the site to Middlesex, down Foley, back to the Orange Line, all of that anything that we can do there without me getting into detail is about making sure that we're trying to enhance that experience. And so I think, you know, just even in terms of talking about the directionality coming through the site, we're trying to reinforce that.
So Sarah, who's in charge of that then? Who's designing that if Sasaki AECOM is not doing it?
The actual connector itself, I'm actually going to, Courtney, are you still here? Do you want to address that?
Sure. So I am Courtney Kirk, the senior planner in the Public Space Urban Forestry Department and the project manager for the Kensington Connector project, which is just the MassDOT property underneath 93. So that is a project that is ongoing between the city of Somerville and MassDOT.
And
So the spaces beyond that are not in that scope of work.
So just to add to that, the Public Space and Urban Forestry team has been working with the EDGE team and letting them know what our schedule is for the improvements to the Kensington Connector, and also having conversations about the public space as it develops with this project. So they are connected, and we have been communicating. So that we will talk about that in the public space application.
Okay. I mean, that's good. I was not aware of that. I'm happy to hear that the EDGE team is involved in it, because I mean, obviously it goes through their site, and we want to make sure that it's correlated. It's not like, you know, two things that are not communicating with each other, but it's one thing that just flows together and it enhances both of them. So
I'm really hopeful that the level of sort of explanation and diagramming that went into explaining the architecture is also applied to the landscape too, because I would argue that it's beyond a visual gateway. It really is a true gateway to the city of Somerville and East Somerville especially.
Absolutely.
If there was one thing, Victor, that I would say that I would love to see a little bit more detail that you touched upon, and I think that it's an opportunity, and I would like to see more of it. You talk about the balconies that happen on the openings of the building that happen throughout different parts of it. I think seeing some of that in more detail, how those balconies are incorporated less diagrammatically and more in this scale of development. Yeah, closer to that. So really we see it a little bit more how that works. And I think that when you start thinking about materiality and a lot of those things, I think that you'll be able to really present that a little bit more in detail and elegantly. But I think that I would love to see that, because it's a nice idea. It's a great idea, and I would hate for it to be lost or just not continue through. So I would love to see a little bit more detail as to really how those balconies are working.
Yes, I don't have more detail on the show beyond what I've already shown, but it absolutely, if I can find the slide, it is the intent. I think it's actually, interestingly, it's been something that's been here consistently throughout the project, you know, because I do think that EDGE has got this mission to make sure that people are feeling connected to the outdoor space. And, you know, we all know that for all the tenants that we work with and the customers that we work with, that outdoor space is always something that seems to be on people's checklist that they would love to get in their space as part of their space, and so often you can't find it, right? And so I think anything like this just starts to add value to the project as well as life to the story.
Yeah. Right. So I think that understanding, with dimensions, how it would be inhabited, how it associates with the rest of the building and the facade, I think those would be key things because, yeah, you're correct. I think those are key components in trying to provide healthy buildings. Yep.
Can I ask for as we're talking about that level of detail, I think the first step that we should, to see if there's a motion on if we have a preferred massing option. And so given the sort of Frank's line of questioning, I'm making assumptions, but I am not a voting member of this commission. So I'd like to make sure that we are clear on that to begin with.
Right. I mean, it's for my personal sense, I've been doing some of the talk initially. I mean, I think I do like the preferred scheme that they've been presenting, in which it opens up the wedges with the balconies. Obviously, they've developed a lot more detail to this than the other ones. I would say that I like the direction of, creating these winter gardens and opening the facade as they did with balconies. So I would say that for myself, I think this is my preferred massing scheme.
Okay. Quick question, Dan, am I allowed to make a motion?
You're allowed to request a motion from the others. The three voting member, one of the three voting members has to make a motion.
Okay. Go ahead, Deborah. I'm sorry.
I make a motion that we support Edge's proposal for, I think this was option 3.
I second that motion.
In terms of massing.
Okay.
Yeah, this is my preferred by far.
Yeah.
All right. For the record, I am going to do a roll call vote that the Urban Design Commission prefers massing option number 3. Deborah?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Frank?
Yes.
Okay, we have our first official vote. Thank you. So 3 to, it's a unanimous support of option number 3.
Our first Zoom vote too. Keep that in mind.
Yes. Okay, I'm sorry to keep interrupting. Please, sort of, I think the board keeps going. Sort of, we had started on the architectural base, and it sounds like we've got some outstanding issues. Do we want to talk? Where do we want to go next? To talk a little bit more about the ground story and the indoor-outdoor, or?
What additional things do we need to make decisions on tonight?
Whether you have priority guidelines, are there specific of these, the guidelines that we're required to review? Are there specific ones that we've talked about materiality? Obviously, that's something that you would like them to come back with more detail on. Whether there are other priority of these first 11 guidelines.
Sarah, I might add that the commission does not need to engineer a priority guideline if it does not feel that any of those are of priority. But if you do, it is asking you to call that out.
Yeah, so in that matter, again, what I would say is Victor, you've gone through an incredible way of really expressing the facades and the way that the windows are working, which is a great detail. I would love to see a little bit more of that detail on the ground level. I think that the ground level is missing some of that detail and some of that language. was looking at some of the renderings that were proposed, and you know, a lot of those that were proposed as part of the urban realm discussion in the landscape. So there's very little articulation sometimes that we get to see with the development of the ground level, aside the one that is associated with that rendering, that really nice rendering that you have on figure 3.1.2, the facade design. So that's the only detail that we see, and I think that it would be good to see the ground level, how the building is hitting the ground on all sides, a little bit more explained and better, so that we can actually see some of the implications of the requirements from the design guidelines applied to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like it was very hard to understand the scale of, there wasn't enough context, I guess, to really appreciate scale, and I agree with that. The other thought I had was, I feel like the whole strategy of this, they're going to, our purview is, what this thing looks like, its massing, how people perceive this. I would love to see perspectives that take advantage, and I suspect some perspectives take advantage of these folds and seeing these balconies and other sort of key moves of the massing. And I think that would be helpful going forward to also then evaluate materials and the way the facade development in terms of materials is progressive. And I would say that's true of sort of how the top gets developed. To Frank's point, it's not a, we don't need a hat on this, but how does this meet the sky? I think it's going to very much depend on, how the materials, and photovoltaics are very much, and the technologies of that are very much a part of that. So I think this material, for me, the priorities are material, understanding materials. I agree with Frank on the ground plane, and also some key views that are things that people are going to really perceive. I'm also sort of fascinated, I have to put this out there, of how this is going to be perceived from the car. Not that I'm not car centric, sure, but I think a lot of people are going to experience this driving by. I know right now Encore is dominating the landscape, even though it's pretty far away compared to this. But I think, what is this like to drive past, in both directions? Yep. So I think that's another piece that may drive, I think, the way you think about materials, what's more specular, what's flat, and I guess that's going to play in with the technology a bit also. And I have to say that I agreed with the second scheme for the development here of the, I guess that's the facade texture and all, system and material. I thought that was also the stronger scheme. And I don't know how rational it is, because there's just so much rationalizing. It's rationalized to the point of being poetic. And I'm wondering if what appears sort of random in this, the skyline, I guess, whether that is something that's a function of where there are gaps between buildings, or how that patterning was developed, and whether a part of this rational system or something other.
Do you mean the bigger fold, Deborah, or are you referring to the detailed facade articulation, the patterning?
Detailed facade. Yeah.
I'll just touch on it real quick. It's going back to this drawing, right? And so I think you need to understand what it is to understand the rationale behind it, but it is being generated truly by the amount of light that is falling on a particular part of the facade over the course of a year. So it is a direct mapping of this set of gradients to the facade, so that we are both maximizing our power generation as well as minimizing our solar intake inside the building. And we also just thought it, in the end, wound up happening to look very beautiful as well, giving us sort of a nice movement across the facade that looks almost random, but is actually incredibly logical and performance driven.
Yeah. That's what I thought. I thought that was the story here, but I think that is I think that's pretty powerful. And I don't know if it has anything to do with views, whether you get, I mean, breaks in buildings create more opportunity for sunlight to hit the building. But yeah, anyway, I think that's, I think it's pretty successful.
So do I hear a potential another motion for the selection of the elevation options?
Sure.
Andrew makes a motion to accept.
You need to pick a scheme, Andrew.
Also,
option
it
B.
might be helpful to explain how votes are had. So someone has to say, I move to do this, and then someone says, I second, and then the other person says,
I move to accept option B as the facade of preference.
I second that.
Okay, and Deborah second. All right, it's going to do a roll call vote. Deborah?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Frank?
Yes. The one thing that I was going to ask Victor that I would love to see is, do you think that it's possible to generate a section that comes across 93 through the space between the building and 93 and your building, just to understand that space in between and to just have an understanding of the relationship of the two? I would love to see that.
So to build on that too, you have on some of your images that you have, your existing condition images, it would be great to have one that is coming out of the Kensington underpass at base level so that we understand what that experience is. Right now, we're only seeing it from the freeway.
Sure. Yep.
And then on the
actually,
yeah.
Sorry, let me just jump ahead here for a second. I know we're not looking at this, but well, we're on the off ramp, so we're just a little bit above that elevation. But this is basically coming out of the Kensington connector is 15 feet below us at the moment.
I think it's the next slide. Flip to the next slide. Or the next.
That's
No.
that's fully.
That's looking forward.
Okay, well, there you go.
There you go.
Okay. That will be helpful when we discuss sort of everything. I think having that one elevation that we had, having a little more context on that as well, which it looks like we'll probably get into when we get to the open space. The elevation of the first floor, it's very glassy and beautiful, and you're right, it is very evocative, but it is a little harder to understand in the context of the public storage building and the side of the freeway and the back of the Kmart, just sort of understanding how that much glassiness and how that the openness and the sort of glowing nature of that is going to relate to some context that's not always ideal.
Agreed, but also you're talking about this particular facade here, the one that's facing the Kensington open space, or the one that's facing Middlesex?
Yeah, the one that we're facing here. Like this is sort of the first time we're seeing it with all of the context of the park in front of it.
Yep. No, I think we agree with you, and which is particularly a big part of the reason why the redevelopment of this open space is so important. Because we do want a better front, right? Not just for the entire district, not just for this connector coming out from under the overpass, but also for the front door of the building, right? To make something here that when you are sitting inside that space looking out, there's a great space to be part of, which is, I think, why we're saying, actually, we want that to be very transparent. It is a motivator to create a great open outdoor space here. Because, yes, the public storage building is not exactly a architectural icon at the moment in the back of Kmart. While we know that site's all going to eventually get redeveloped, who knows in what fashion and exactly what that will be, but to do everything that we possibly can to create a great place and make sure that you feel like you're part of a broader area, not just in the lobby of a building.
As there's a lot of discussion right now about materials and wanting to see more details, storefront and those sort of elements, it sounds like we're talking about doing a second meeting.
Yes.
So is that something I'm going to recommend that within the next, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, we should get something on the calendar. Does 2 weeks work with the commission and the design team? Would that be enough time to develop answers to some of these questions that are being posed? So I'll ask the commission first of all.
Yes, I think that we would like to see another view of this, responding to some of the questions.
Okay. All right. So Dan, do you know what the date is? 2 weeks from today? Is that a possibility?
You caught me without a calendar open, but I will look.
Okay,
It would be June
9th.
June 9th.
I know. Oh no, that's okay. Never mind. June 9th.
Yeah, I'm looking at the city council calendar and there's no land use committee that day. So can we tentatively say June 9th?
Partially a question for the Edge team also, if they think they can respond in that amount of time.
In a 2-week time, yes.
Yeah.
I'll speak. I think that we can. No, I think that we can. Let me just address these one by one to make sure that we're all on the same page of level of development of detail. I'll start with balconies because that's the easy one. I think we can go through that. We're not going to have like construction drawing details, obviously, but I think we can start to define the scale of those spaces and how a person might occupy them, as well as level of transparency. That I think we can do. Crown, top of the building, I think we can address that. The level of detail along the building facade at the street front and the entry, I think we can do a better job of addressing that. Like I said, we're not going to have mullion profiles and details or anything like that, but I think we can give another level of development there. Building materiality, I think we can give a very good representative palette. It's not going to be absolute final material selections because we're still in schematic design and we're going to continue to refine the PV systems and all that. But I think we can get a good sense of, okay, this PV panel, because of the efficiency we're trying to hit, is probably going to be a darker panel, and that means that the rest of the material is going to be this. And yes, we want these to be wood or a wood-like material, and it's probably in this tone. And this is where we want to develop texture. So I think if those things work, then we can probably get there for what you're looking for, if that makes sense, what I just described.
Okay, and I would like to point out that this is also it is all facades are primary on this building. So paying attention to that. The other piece I would like to add regarding the materiality that I had heard was the understanding how the storefront actually works, sort of the solid and void of that ground level interface from a materiality standpoint as well. And I think you were probably touching on that when you talked about sort of the streetscape side of things, but I just wanted to be clear.
Yep. Well, can I ask a pointed question to that then? Just because I think we want to get more understanding, and I know this was sort of one of the commentaries. We understand at least what's written in the design guidelines and what the intent is there, and I understand that coming from the board, the goal is to get a little bit more refinement and development here in terms of, okay, what is the scale? How does a person actually interact with all of this? We'll continue to work on that. We can do that. I guess to be blunt, my question is, let's put aside the need for more detail and all that. Is what's being shown here compliant? And I'm not asking from a legal standpoint. I'm just trying to understand because I want to come back with something that fully responds and something that is compliant. We've done our best. We've done a stab here at creating something that we think is meeting what's called out in the guidelines. but I'm just trying to specifically ask that question. Obviously, more detail, more refinement, no problem. I just want to make sure we're going down the right path in terms of understanding what's there.
From a zoning perspective, I think sort of once we understand the material, as I said, speaking from a zoning perspective, as in the staff review, once we understand more of the materiality and how the dimensional of the framing and sort of what are sign bands and where some of those elements that are going to be basic within a storefront lie, I think this is.
Like, I mean, like that entire base is not all going to be glass. You know, it's going to be spandrel, it's probably going to be metal. So a little bit more understanding of that. The glass is not going to hit the floor as it seems, right? So, and then the glass is not going to go from the floor to the top of the coffee shop, I assume. There might be mullions in between. So you're right, Victor. I think that you're around satisfying some of it, but I think that you need a little bit more detail to bring it to a little bit more of a reality that we can say, okay, we understand what's happening there.
Yeah, and that's fine. I just want to make sure that we are, at least in terms of general approach, right? That it's like, no, this facade has to get 50% more opaque, right? Because that's the only way you're going to get a portal. That's what I want to avoid. I don't want to come back and have done completely the wrong approach. I totally get the intent for more detail, but I just want to make sure that as far as everyone understands, with that additional level of refinement, that additional level of detail, this seems to be meeting at least the spirit of those guidelines. You know, I would hate to come back and find out that what we started off with, we were just going in completely the wrong direction to begin with. That's all I'm trying to avoid.
Okay, and as long as you understand that some of those panels, as Frank said, do need to be opaque, just because of sort of the nature.
That's not what I. Okay, but I guess this is my question. That's not what I just took from what Frank said. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to understand. Frank, the way I took Frank, and correct me if I'm wrong, Frank was adding a level of realism to this, but
Correct.
Just because we need another mullion in there doesn't necessarily mean that has to be a spandrel panel. It could still be a vision panel with a beam and a soffit setback. That's what I'm trying to understand. If
correct, I think
more opaque is required.
No, just bringing it to the level of realism as to what it's going to be moving forward. You know, what is spandrel, what is metal, so that, you know, we understand a little bit more the intent of the base and the articulation of it. So that's what I was trying to do.
And right, and despite the Urban Design Commission sort of doing the design review, there are certain requirements in the zoning ordinance that need to be met. And so making sure that the storefront frame is established as it is in the as it is specified in the guidelines, is making sure that we're meeting the intent of the zoning.
Yep, that's the question that I'm asking, but that's fine.
Okay. All right. Are there any more questions or issues that the commission would like to talk about at this time, knowing that we are going to be having another meeting with some more details?
Not from me.
I have a question. So are we going to have one meeting that answers these questions and goes into open space, or are we going to do another meeting to answer these questions about this more, and then another one that goes to the open?
Seeing that Sarah's coughing right now, we could schedule them all together if the design team's prepared to make a presentation that's separate related to the open space, and that would be more efficient if they're going to reappear in short order. But it's you know, whether or not they're ready to make that presentation or not.
We were planning on doing it tonight, so yes, that's not a problem. And I'll speaking from our point of view, I would think it would be beneficial in general just to be able to understand them in relationship to one another. So that would be our preference.
Yes, please.
Okay. All right.
So
Then,
can I make also a suggestion, maybe then for next time, then if we're doing it on the 9th, is the team then presenting the public realm, and then after that response to the architecture in one meeting?
I was going to make a recommendation. If you want to do it without any discussion, and if I heard Victor correctly, they're ready to present the open space this evening, we could do an overview presentation of
Sarah,
that
it's
open
not on the
space.
agenda.
It's okay. All right. I'm sorry,
Can't
Dan.
Yeah, we can't do it tonight legally.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't have 4 hours.
Okay. So then I think we have do we have a motion to have a second meeting on this project on Tuesday, June 9th?
I motion to have a second meeting on to the June 9th.
I second that motion.
All right, roll call vote. Deborah?
Yes, I agree.
Andrew? And Frank?
Yes.
Okay. And that will be to answer the architecture questions and to present the open space. I guess then all we need this evening is a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right. All in favor, roll call vote. Deborah?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Okay, and Frank?
Yes.
All right. Thank you all. So this meeting is at 8:40 p.m. is now adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I
Victor.
ask an informal?
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Victor. Thank you, everybody on the team. Nice to meet you, Frank, Andrew, and Deborah.
Thank you.
Nice
I
project.
hope it's not, Sarah, just a question for you. I hope it's not too late. So does that mean the agenda for the next meeting, the order, is going to come out later, or do we already have that established? Sorry.
Well, it'll officially come out later, but my hunch would say we answered the questions that were brought up this evening first, and then move on to the open space.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, all.
Good night. Thanks.
Okay, Sarah,
Good night.
I have a question.
Go ahead,
yeah.
Deborah.
Yeah, just quickly, is there a reason why we can't see the presenters? Is that a part of the protocol for these public meetings or whatever, these commission meetings?
So they can talk.
ahead,
It's
Dan.
just that there's a limited number of people that will display in the video. And we're still learning how to end up with all of the right presenters at the top of the screen for the long-term thing. So
Yeah. Okay.
in the next meeting, we can be more specific about who's invited as a panelist, and then that will help with the number of people that will show up at the top.
Great.
And one
Yeah,
of the
because
things I think
it's helpful to see people. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think sort of, for example, whether you see Louisa and I as co-chairs on video or not, or it's just the person who is actually speaking and doing the presenting, that could be something that we make a decision about.
Great.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Did you have fun, little bear? You sweaty. You run